So how does the Neo Geo compare to the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis? For many people, the comparison starts with, well, the Neo Geo is the one I didn't have. And you know what they say, it's hard to enjoy something if you don't have it. Check out me driving my Ferrari. Except, even though most of us didn't own a Neo Geo back in the day, many of us did play the arcade cabinet, which makes sense given the fact that's what the Neo Geo was originally intended to be. Unlike the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo that were designed to be home consoles from the start, the Neo Geo becoming a home console was more of a, well, I guess we can type of decision. Too bad the marketing didn't reflect that attitude. SNK, the makers of the Neo Geo, did release the Neo Geo in a consoleized form at the same time as the initial release of the arcade cabinets and with the same technical specs, but it was not the type of consoleized hardware you would buy off the shelf of a Target or Toys R Us, at least not right away in 1990. Instead, they came up with the Neo Geo rental system, which sounds exciting, but before you assume this was something that Timmy and his dad could rent from Blockbuster one weekend because Timmy got an A- on his math test, way to go Timmy, I'm here to tell you it wasn't like that. And again, remember that I'm talking about the year 1990. At that point, for starters, this specific rental system was only in Japan. Gosh, Japan always got all the cool stuff. And what have we got over them? Dunkaroos? But these rental systems were in larger game stores and only available for rent to commercial establishments, which could include various businesses such as a restaurant chain or hotel. However, SNK started getting feedback that some consumers would be willing to pay the big bucks to actually own this consoleized version of the Neo Geo, which prompted SNK to give into this demand and release it to the public as the Neo Geo AES in 1991, marketed as a luxury product, which basically means something that is not intended for everyone. To use their words, it was only for hot dogs, real hot dogs that is, no weenies allowed, whereas the Genesis and Super Nintendo were designed for weenies, cocktail wieners, little smokies, and hot dogs, but just not real ones, bratwursts, or whatever type of tubed meat a person wanted to compare themselves to. Yeah, the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo were designed to be purchased by everyone, at least everyone who likes video games, which shouldn't that just be everyone? They were trying to sell their console to as many people as possible. Seems rational enough. If they wanted to make their consoles more powerful, they could have, but did not in order to keep the price down and therefore keep their consoles more commercially viable. In any case, with the release of the Neo Geo AES, it was now at least possible for anyone to purchase a consoleized Neo Geo. Maybe little Timmy's local Blockbuster would even have it for rent now too. The problem is that the price to own one made it feel like it may as well have been impossible. $650 for the console itself at launch, and even if you could somehow afford the console, getting the games really made things difficult, costing roughly 100 to 300 buckaroos each, and bearing in mind that this was the early 90s, could have been a tricky purchase for parents to rationalize. Well, do we want to just use little Billy's college fund on a Neo Geo instead? I mean, hey, it is an education in 2D gaming awesomeness. But the Neo Geo being expensive wasn't SNK just being mean or stupid. This was actual arcade hardware. In most ways, far more powerful than a more conventional home console. It makes sense it wouldn't be cheap. It could be said the Neo Geo existed in its own unique space, separate from the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. And because the initial intention of the Neo Geo was to be an arcade machine / rental machine and not a home console like the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, in many ways, it doesn't really make sense to compare them. So, on that note, let's compare them. The first similarity they share is interchangeable cartridges. Yes, part of what made the Neo Geo arcade cabinets so popular in arcades is the same thing that made the Genesis and Super Nintendo so popular at home. all the different game cartridges that you could change in and out of them. Except that the Neo Geo could even handle multiple cartridges plugged into it at the same time, whereas the other consoles couldn't. Oh, well, I stand corrected. The interchangeable Neo Geo cartridges were a huge advantage in the arcades because now arcade owners could offer more games to their patrons by simply swapping out these cartridges instead of having additional cabinets weighing hundreds of pounds shipped in. Although it could be said that a game like Ghouls and Ghosts weighed 300 pounds in psychological warfare from its difficulty. And while sure, some arcade owners would swap the boards out of cabinets, the Neo Geo made it all so seamless. Each cartridge came with one of these kits, allowing you to update the outside of the cabinet with the proper branding and information. And cartridge swapping is Timmy-proof. It couldn't be any easier. Alright, but now let's talk about the power difference between the Neo Geo, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis, since that's the difference that gets pointed out most often. What exactly do you get with the Neo Geo and its extra power? You know, besides being able to call kids on the playground weenies. Well, going by the technical specs, it could handle far more colors, including more colors on screen all at once, far more sprites on screen at once, as well as a number of other technical advantages. With the hardware put into practice when looking at the games themselves, one of the main things I notice is that the sprites are often much larger than the typical sprites seen in Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis games, as well as the games having far more detail in the sprite work overall, whether it be the characters, background, or what have you. I've always thought the sprite work was impressive enough to be hung on a wall as artwork, but don't just take my word for it, not everyone agrees with my personal sense of art. The animation also tends to be really impressive, and when combined with the level of detail in the pixel art itself, it's quite a sight to behold. I will say though that despite the more advanced hardware of the Neo Geo, the Super Nintendo and Genesis did still have some visual techniques you didn't really see on the Neo Geo, or at least not as much. Biggest one would be parallax scrolling, where you have different layers that could scroll independently of each other at different speeds. Parallax scrolling definitely adds something to certain games for me. Then there was the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 effect. While the Neo Geo certainly had some scaling and rotating abilities of its own, the emphasis of Mode 7 in many Super Nintendo games helped to add in a distinct flavor to its library. But as far as raw power goes, the Neo Geo clearly had the edge. I mean, it could be argued that it took all the way up to the Dreamcast until Neo Geo games received ports that were close to being one-to-one to the arcade. The Saturn did have some pretty nice ports itself though. But part of the reason why Neo Geo games were still getting ported for so long is because they were still being made. Yeah, the Neo Geo had a really long life. Starting in 1990, it was supported all the way until 2004, at least in terms of games coming out. This is yet one more thing that can make comparing the Neo Geo to the Super Nintendo and Genesis awkward. The Neo Geo lived long enough to understand certain references that the other consoles just didn't. A lot of its games came out when Sega and Nintendo had already shifted their focus to later consoles, and in Sega's case, death. Take Metal Slug for instance, one of the franchises that the Neo Geo is most well known for. The first Metal Slug game came out in 1996. Nintendo released Super Mario 64 that year. What are we even doing comparing these consoles to the Neo Geo? Whose idea was this? Oh, that's right, it was mine. The thing is that Neo Geo was still extremely relevant during the time of the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, with a lot of its notable releases coming out at that point, and a lot of games that were very impressive on a technical level too. So if the Neo Geo happened to be supported for a long time after, that doesn't magically make those early years of its existence disappear. It just means we need to have some context in mind if we're going to compare 1999's Mark of the Wolves to something like, I don't know, Echo the Dolphin. Alright, But when it comes to the games themselves on these platforms, the biggest thing that always jumps out to me is who was developing which games for what system. Naturally, each company released games for their own system. Nintendo released games for the Super Nintendo, Sega released games for the Genesis, and SNK released games for the Neo Geo, as well as the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. Wait, what? Yep, but they got the weenie versions. When it comes to other companies developing games for the Neo Geo besides SNK themselves, you have, well, not a lot of household names. Windex, Energizer, Lysol, Colgate, none of these were to be found. Nazca might be the most notable one, making the first few Metal Slug games, aka the ones people tend to like the best, and they did such a good job that SNK just straight up purchased them. There's a handful of games released by companies like Taito, Data East, and Hudson Soft, a company called Visco who was decent, made a bunch of games for them, but it was mostly up to SNK themselves to make games, which they did a terrific job of, but it could have been nice to have the type of support that the Genesis and especially Super Nintendo had. The Super Nintendo had support not only from Nintendo themselves, who were no slouches at making quality games, but also from Capcom, Square, Rareware, every friend at my school's mom, Quintet, Natsume, Konami, as well as others. Meanwhile, the Genesis had a lot of support as well, with Konami, even if they didn't support the console immediately, providing a lot of support in the end. A small splash of support from Capcom, getting Street Fighter II was massive at the time, and some of the best games from that generation coming from New Kid on the Block, Treasure, who had a really clever motto at the time: make good games. But similar to SNK and Neo Geo, the Genesis had to rely on Sega itself for quite a few of its better titles, and like SNK, they did a great job of cranking out some quality games. However, regardless of who developed how many games, how well they did it, and for which console, the biggest differences between the console's game libraries may just come in the form of which genres the games fell into. The Neo Geo is often categorized as having nothing but fighting games, which I find to be a bit misleading, but it certainly does specialize in fighting games and has a ton of them. I mean, it was an arcade machine in the 90s during Street Fighter fever. It's like finding fruit in a smoothie. It makes perfect sense. That being said, it did still have some great games in other genres as well. Lots of fun sports games, and we're talking arcade-style sports games that tend to land better with people who don't really like sports in real life, as well as a handful of really good puzzle games. Bust-A-Move is my personal all-time favorite puzzle game. It's just so colorful and satisfying to play. I love it. There's some good shoot-'em-ups, and also a lot of great run-and-gun games, with the famous Metal Slug series getting a lot of attention. But also some really good lesser-known games like Shock Troopers, kind of a different take on the genre. And of course, if you do like fighting games, you will absolutely be covered there. It's when you get to longer form games like RPGs and adventure games that Neo Geo falls behind the competition. I mean, it is an arcade machine, so it makes sense. It's going to specialize in shorter games. Imagine how many quarters it would take to get through Final Fantasy VI on an arcade machine. You also didn't see much in the way of licensed properties on the Neo Geo either, which in a way could be a good thing. I don't remember anybody banging down the doors for Wizard of Oz on Neo Geo, but that did mean that stuff like the Ninja Turtles were left out. Kind of a bummer. Can you imagine how awesome a Ninja Turtles game would have been on Neo Geo? And yet, the Neo Geo was awesome nonetheless, even if it did have a very different origin story from the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. And while I've made the case that in a lot of ways it doesn't make sense to compare them, we're talking video games, and so of course we're going to. So with all of that said from me, how would you compare the Neo Geo to these two consoles? Would love to hear your thoughts, so as always, leave your response down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's the